Hello, I'm Shihoko Goto, Director for Geoeconomics and Deputy Director of the Wilson Center's Asia program. Thank you very much for joining us today, wherever you may be logging in from. Exactly a month ago, the Wilson Center hosted a private discussion on economic security and prospects for US-Korea cooperation. Specifically, we focused on two issues in particular: the global supply chain of semiconductors, and the future of developing the EV, the electric vehicle market in the United States and Korea and beyond. The semiconductor discussion in particular covered a great deal of ground that addressed some of the key issues facing technology cooperation, coordination, and confronting the risks posed by China from a security perspective. In fact, the discussion was so widely well received, and I'm delighted to say that we've been able to bring the band back to have this public forum. Our speakers who joined us then have graciously agreed to join us today. And even though it's only been 4 weeks since we last got together, we've seen significant developments in the international semiconductor industry, most notably with China retaliating against the United States' export control rules by initiating a dispute in the WTO against the United States of abusing control measures. So, what is the outlook for the semiconductor industries of the United States, Korea, as US-China technology competition intensifies? And how will technology competition impact bilateral and multilateral relations more broadly moving forward? So I'm very happy and incredibly grateful to our all-star lineup of speakers joining us today. First up will be Robert Atkinson, founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, one of the world's top think tanks for science and technology policy. Rob has been named as one of the 3 most important thinkers about innovation by the New Republic. He served and advised the Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations in a variety of capacities, including with the National Innovation and Competitiveness Strategy Advisory Board. The list goes on. Next up will be Kevin Wolf, who is a partner at the venerable law firm of Aiken Gump. He was previously Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration, and today he is one of the most highly sought after legal minds on export control and trade policies more broadly. As if advising clients on how to navigate the latest policy developments doesn't keep him busy enough, he's also active in the media, being interviewed by the New York Times, Financial Times, Washington Post, and so on. And I'm thrilled to be joined by Jay Turan, Director of Government Affairs at Samsung Electronics. Jay previously served as Global Policy Manager at SEMI, a global semiconductor industry association, and he was the Director of Services and Digital Trade at the Coalition of Services Industries, and he's also served as Policy Advisor at Third Way. He's also worked in positions focused on economics at the Council on Foreign Relations, Google Ideas, which is now Jigsaw, Goldman Sachs, West Point. So with that, let me first turn to you, Rob.
Thank you. So we're in a relatively, I would say, a new world, in fact, an unprecedented world, particularly over the last few years, where a couple of things have happened. One is we finally have woken up to the reality that China is not a normal country when it comes to technology and economic development. They're not like every other country that is, most countries are trying to advance their, certain key industries. China's different in 2 ways. One is they're trying to advance and gain global dominance in pretty much every industry, every advanced industry. They're not looking at this from a Ricardian trade comparative advantage perspective. Korea is fantastic at semiconductors, not very good at aerospace. You don't see Korea going, we want to become the dominant aerospace country in the world. yet you see that from China. They want to be dominant in aerospace and semiconductors and biotechnology. They're already dominant in high-speed rail and telecom equipment and in solar panels. So you name it. So that's number one. Number two is the vast array and extent of unfair trade practices that China employs. This goes way, way beyond what the Asian tigers did in the 70s and 80s to move up the value chain and become more competitive. Just orders of magnitude greater. And also, as we all know, vast IP theft, forced tech transfer, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, that puts China and the challenge of China in a completely different category. On top of that, if you understand sort of just where the strengths and weaknesses are, we issued a report recently called the Hamilton Index on Advanced Industries. And what we did is we looked at 10 countries, including Korea and Japan and China and the US and all. And we looked at seven advanced industries: aerospace, computers and semiconductors, biotechnology, machinery and equipment. So looked at 7 of those. And what we found was that the amount of those industries in China as a share of their GDP is 34% greater than the global average. So they're doing okay. Korea is actually double the global average. Korea's doing great, really strong in these advanced industries, particularly because of semiconductors. Where's the US? The US is actually below the global average. We're 0.96. Excuse me. When you take out IT services, think the Googles of the world and the Microsofts of the world, we fall all the way down to 0.8. In other words, we have 80%, those industries account for 20% less of our economy than they do for the global economy. And that includes all these other countries that you wouldn't think of as powerhouses. So if we wanted to equal the share of those industries that China has, we're talking $780 billion more output in the US. So that's point number one, is the US is no longer the global dominant leader in these advanced industries. And that has a lot of important implications. One of the implications that I'm sure Kevin will talk about is it really limits our ability to be the unilateral hegemon when it comes to all of these measures we use, like export controls. Back in the old days, it was a lot easier for us to do that because we were so strong relative to other people. But the second important factor of that is it requires us to work more collaboratively with our allies. We simply aren't big enough and powerful enough and strong enough to do this all on our own. Back in the early 1960s, the United States government spent more on R&D than the entire rest of the world combined, government and business combined. So take all of the companies around the world and take all of the governments around the world, and they spent less on R&D than the US government. So we could call the shots. We were dominant. We can't do that today. So that's why we have to really think carefully about cooperation on export controls, cooperation on how do we cooperate on semiconductor production. The Biden administration did this 2 nanometer initiative with Japan. Korea needs to be a part of that. We need to have alliances on advanced computing, on electric vehicles, on a whole set of other areas where we each have strengths. But if we work together, particularly having our companies lead these efforts, I think we can go beyond where we could go just individually.
Thanks so much for really setting the stage on where we are today, and so I hope we can come back to this whole idea of coordinated efforts on a multilateral level too. Before I turn to Kevin, I do want to remind those who are watching us live that we are taking questions. Please submit your question in the chat box at the bottom of your screen as you watch us live today. So with that, Kevin.
Sure. Just wanted to put the export controls that we're reading about in the media in historical context, and that thus shows what I think a sea change is occurring, and we're living through a real inflection point in the scope and purpose and policy objectives of export controls. And the main question of the day is the extent to which allies agree and align their domestic systems with what the U.S. is doing and the reasons for it. And the short version is that during the Cold War, the purpose of export controls had as strategic objectives to contain the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. During at the end of the Cold War, export controls shifted to a regime-based system of 4 different groups of countries regulating the lists of items that had some clear relevance to the development, production, or use of either weapons of mass destruction or conventional military items, that expanded somewhat to include objectives for anti-terrorism related purposes. During 2017 and 18, there was a rather spirited public debate as part of a legislative discussion about whether and how to expand the scope and purpose of export controls to deal with national security issues being created by China's change in its technology acquisition policies and requirements within the country to use commercial technologies to modernize its military, as well as uses of commercial technologies to commit human rights abuses. There were lots of discussions about what emerging and foundational technologies should be also controlled that were essential to national security, but not within this classical system. There was not much clear definition, however, to what those terms meant until first with the Allied response to the Russian invasion. That was the first use plurilaterally of strategic export controls to achieve broader than classical objectives. And then the October 7th rule set out basically a per se rule based upon a policy vision that that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had given in September, that the very existence of indigenous capabilities in China of advanced node semiconductors and semiconductor production equipment and advanced computing items and supercomputers was a per se national security issue for the United States, and the controls that were announced limited all of the inputs, whether US or foreign or from US persons, into the indigenous development of those 4 things. And so where we are today is a discussion about how the controls can be made more effective and not counterproductive by bringing allies on board and trying to align allied export control policies to address the same common issues, and how you define that national security issue. So there's much more detail thereafter, but that's like the 5-minute summary of where we are today and where we came from.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was a terrific summary of where we are. And also, I think it's really important to bear in mind that although we are really grappling with great changes, we can actually learn from precedents, and especially precedents is incredibly important as we are establishing the rules. So Jay, let me turn now to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much to the Wilson Center for the invitation. And one thing I'll note, the best part about going last is, of course, especially on such an august panel, is that my job is to basically just kind of get on base. I need to effectively, tie a few threads together and make a few additional points here. So with that, I wanted to kind of start with the broader idea of the semiconductor industry, right? This is an industry maybe that stands on its own, unique in its own capabilities, that brings together thousands of parts running on thousands of process steps, that brings together equipment vendors, materials providers, subcomponent suppliers, all of which have their own ecosystems that build and support countless end-use products, right? And despite economic headwinds right now, demand is kind of forecast to be strong. And we're seeing that kind of played out by the continued investments in this country from Korean companies, as well as other companies in support of leading edge capabilities, legacy capabilities for use in every type of application you can imagine. I note that investments happening here in the US, but when we look at the industry more broadly, while it is here, while it is in Europe, while it is in many continents around the world, it's largely in terms of capacity, shifted towards Asia, right? And when we think about Korea, as Rob rightly noted, much of that capacity, especially on the memory side, is from Korean companies. 75% of that, at least, is from Korean companies, with Samsung leading the way, just below 40%. And this comes down to priorities, right? Certain countries and companies within those countries have recognized how important, how fundamental semiconductors are to not just economic products, not just your computers, your tablets, your phones, all these devices, but also fundamental to national security. They are part of the warfighter. They're part of weapons, technology systems that are used in the intelligence community. So these products are a part of every part of our day in life. Now, the good thing here, right, as I noted kind of and touched on, is that the US has recognized this. Going back about 5 years now, right, there's this broader turn and recognition of how important semiconductors are. But the big issue is there's this large cost gap, right? This is something you've heard about in previous reporting, whether it's through SIA and BCG, a joint report coming from them a few years back. But the cost gap stands to be 30% plus between US and ROK. So how do you close that gap? And the CHIPS Act does a substantial amount in not only grants, but also the tax credit and the complementary factors of both of those that can close that gap. Now, I want to quickly highlight one final point to kind of bring this back to how important Korea is to the semiconductor industry, but also to US bilateral relations. If we go back 18 months, just in the semiconductor industry, there's been $50 billion of investment in our space from Korean companies. That includes $17 billion from Samsung for a leading edge site in Taylor, Texas. They'll produce technologies at the most cutting level for end uses from consumer electronics and in other areas. So this is something that I think Korean companies are very focused on, how to be not only part of the US supply chain, but also support and be part of the economic and national security story here in the US. So with that, I'll give it back to you, Shihoko, and thank you very much.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Jay, for that, and really focusing on the prospect and the need for U.S.-Korea partnership as well as we move forward. So we haven't actually talked about the Chinese retaliation. So we've had greater strategic clarity on the part of the Biden administration. Of course, the October export control rule has really drawn a red line as to where the Biden administration sees what it sees as critical technologies in the semiconductor sector and what can and cannot be shared with China, and taking punitive action against those who would go against it. But now earlier this week, we have China really striking back. It is filing a dispute with the World Trade Organization. It is arguing that the United States is violating WTO rules, and it's actually stifling China's own legitimate rights and interests for technology development. I'm wondering, one, if all three of you can comment on how you see this developing, and then perhaps first to Rob, what does this mean from a multilateral cooperation perspective? So, Rob first.
Yeah, so I may be leaving it up to others sort of how likely they are to prevail in the WTO. I think the odds, frankly, are probably not very high. But I think stepping back, it's I think important to note. It's kind of like one of those things where you're like, you see that and you're going, are you kidding me? You're kidding, right? So here's a country that has limited exports of rare earth materials to Japan to hobble what they were doing. It's a country that has consistently stolen intellectual property to build up their semiconductor industry, as they did from Micron, just to use one example. It's a country that requires some levels of tech transfer in order to build a factory in China, which is a complete violation of the WTO. Why don't they bring that case? We can bring that case. It's a country that has way more subsidies. If you look at the CSIS report recently, that was maybe 4, 5, 6 months ago, it's a great report, and it shows that their semi-subsidies are just vastly higher than what we do. OECD shows the same thing. So you go down the list of just unfair trade practice after unfair trade practice for China, and then they have the audacity to bring a WTO case. I mean, it kind of in one level shows how desperate they are. So I just don't think, this to me is in the laughable category. We shouldn't even take it seriously. Now, well, the problem is, though, that some of our allies, particularly the Europeans, sort of take this thing seriously. And what I mean by that is they still believe that the WTO is an adequate institution to address China. And it is simply not. If it were an adequate institution to address China, it would deal with massive subsidies. It would even deal with subsidy disclosure, which, according to the WTO, China has to do. They don't do even that. It would deal with forced tech transfer, which it doesn't. It would deal with IP theft, which it doesn't. So I think what our allies have got to come to terms with is that we're just simply living in a new world, and that this goes way, way beyond national security. And even if it was just national security, then they should be supporting us because, hey, who's defending Europe right now in Ukraine against the Russian attack? It's us. It's not the Europeans principally, it's us. But leaving that aside, that it's more than national security, the China challenge is a serious challenge to European technology industries all across the board. It's a serious challenge to Korean industries across the board. It's a serious challenge to us. Without this export control regime, and Kevin could say more about it, I think what you would see in 10 years, if not sooner, you would see massive dumping on the scale of massive dumping of memory on the scale of what they did in the steel industry, where they decimated the global steel industry. They would do the exact same thing with memory. And that would mean Samsung, Micron, and SK Hynix are all going to be weaker through unfair means. So again, I don't take any of this seriously, and I hope our trade allies don't take it seriously either.
All right, Kevin. Does it have legs? The Chinese stance of taking this to the WTO or not? And if not, why not? If so, why so?
Yeah, sure. It's there's an Article 21 carve out for WTO cases for national security reasons, and so there's, even with this WTO, I think 0% chance of any success on the merits to the argument. Export controls are and have always been per se excluded from the scope of the requirements. So I don't really see this as part of a substantive effort to accomplish change through the WTO. It's rather to change the public debate, particularly with allies, to convert this from what I believe personally is legitimate national security function, given the relevance of advanced computing capabilities for advanced weapons development, and stated Chinese intentions to use them for that reason, which is a per se national security issue, and trying to convert the public debate into one just of economic competition, and trying to make it so that this is an example of the U.S. trying to advantage U.S. companies over non-U.S. companies, and to fuzz up the debate. Now, it is true that these controls are broader in scope and purpose and technique than has been classically the case. But the WTO suit is really more a matter of the PR and changing the public debate, particularly with the allies, during a time where the U.S. is working with them to articulate common national security issues for aligned responses.
So it's more of a public performance rather than
right. I mean, obviously, I'm not an expert on Chinese psychology, and I haven't talked with anybody in China about it, but that's my perception of it based upon the action and the content. So I'll defer to others who are experts in China policy and who brought this for their authoritative responses, but that's my perception of it from the public reporting.
Interesting. So let's assume that this won't necessarily drive a wedge between the United States and its allies and partners, and that the suit will actually not gain traction with the WTO either. However, we've talked already a number of times about the importance of having multilateral cooperation, that although the United States is really taking unilateral action, and that it is insisting that it has worked to coordinate and has listened to its allies, especially South Korea, as well as Japan, Taiwan, and the like. It's also very difficult to see how this can actually move forward in terms of concrete steps and partnerships. So we have, for instance, the Chip 4 that has been launched by the United States. It's really kind of trying to move forward. One of the challenges, of course, has been trying to get Korea on board. We've already talked about the US-Japan cooperation and potential of that and the most advanced of semiconductor technology development. But Jay, perhaps you can talk a little bit about how the Chip 4 Alliance is actually seen by the private sector, because bearing in mind that the semiconductor supply chain, and when we talk about competitiveness, it's not governments that make semiconductors, it's private companies. And we're asking a lot from them to actually coordinate efforts. How can this actually move forward? Is this a constructive way? And what is, how does a company like Samsung see Chip 4?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, Shoko, and thank you very much for asking it. I'll quickly note this industry in the US certainly started with the government, with public-private partnership, right? Semitech in the 80s here in Texas. This is an industry that relies on and thrives on, I should say, public-private partnership. So any type of industry and government activity is at a broad level supported. When we think about CHIPS 4, right, this aggregation of 4 countries in the semiconductor space, right, we want to think about what are attainable goals and then how do we leverage that for, as we like to think about kind of implementation or commercialization, right? And the issues that can be very helpful today are R&D. Rob mentioned this in the context of US-Japan, but it's an area that US and Korea can pick up, or the broader 4 can pick up here, right? There's a lot of work to be done on talent, right? We talked about the technology, but let's talk about the talent. We need people to be able to produce either the technologies or to conduct the research or partner in the US, right? And so either streamlining of processes and regulations, obviously fundamental, right? I think there's certain policies that are suitable for specific venues, and sometimes, there are others that are best suited for CHIPS 4. So I think if we think about, getting some meat on the bone and trying to take some bites there and then building out from there, right? It can be sometimes a bit too aspirational if we aim very big and then we don't strike or we effectively strike out on all the items. I think it's a much more important start that we pick a few items, start the progress, start the work, and then expand from there.
Thank you. I don't know, Rob, Kevin, if you would like to add anything about prospect.
So the primary media discussion on the plurilateral or allied or trilateral discussion obviously has been with respect to Japan and the Netherlands because of their semiconductor production equipment companies, which are the key topic in this control and whether they'll come on board. But Korea is no less a partner in this discussion, and given the memory companies and a close ally and another techno-democracy along with the United States with common values, and its interests need to be taken into account, and I think the U.S. government is with respect to these actions. So, for example, in the October 7th rule, it applied to the multinational companies that are producing semiconductors in China. And the U.S. responded quite quickly to create general waivers for Hynix and Samsung and Intel and TSMC, which are the 4 multinationals in China, to give the U.S. government and the allies more time, it seems, I infer, to work together at what an approach of common interest would be. And no doubt, I don't know about the CHIPS 4. I don't know how much of a role export controls is or isn't in that. I've not seen any reporting on that. But nonetheless, there was a U.S.-Korea bilateral export control group that was created, which is really quite novel to have a specific country-to-country export control discussion. I mean, there's the EU-U.S. Trade and Technology Council, of which it's a part. A recent one was created for Japan as well, but Korea is really the only other country where there's a specific dialogue and structure to have bilateral export control discussions. So clearly, the U.S. is taking its partnership and alliance with Korea quite high in terms of its list of priorities, and that's the goal here: is to come up with something that is of benefit to all countries dealing with a common threat, and that requires discussion as to how you identify both. And this is a system in place to allow that to happen.
So one point that I think comes up in this discussion, and it's easy for me to say, because unlike Jay, I'm not at a company, at least a company that has to make profits. But you hear a lot about some of these companies, particularly some chip equipment makers who say, well, we really don't want to do this because it's going to cut our sales. And I think one of the things the U.S. government needs to do is make clear that that's probably not true. Sales are determined based upon the overall demand for global semiconductors, and we're not going to change these policies that the Biden administration have put in place will not change demand for semiconductors. They'll change the location of production, but they're not going to change the amount of production. And so, to the extent that ASML loses contracts in China, they're going to pick up those contracts in Korea, or they'll pick them up in Taiwan, or they'll pick them up here. So I do think that's one key point to understand, I think, in this space. As long as we can all work together, it's not like companies, I think, are gonna lose sales, at least in the moderate term. The second point I would make is, we already have a history of programs in the semiconductor industry of cooperation. So we have the Semiconductor Research Corporation, and they run a program called the what's the name of it? It's the StarNet, I think it is. StarNet, yeah. And one of the things that StarNet does is it brings semiconductor companies together along with universities and other key players to build a semiconductor roadmap. Sort of where is the technology going in 10 years or 12 years? What are the most important technological and scientific breakthroughs that the industry needs? We should be building on those kinds of platforms. And I don't know enough about it to say whether Korean and Taiwanese firms are part of that, but that's the kind of thing that we should be building on existing institutional platforms where they exist and really ramp those up to enable our allies and us to work, run faster, essentially. I come back to that because I think it is important that we not lose sight of the fact that while slowing China down is really important, we have to also speed up. If we can keep 2 generations ahead, that is an important thing, and come up with new innovations in how semiconductors are made and what they do.
I mean, that's an important point to bear in mind, that Jake Sullivan's speech in September really was talking about it's no longer adequate simply to have that technology gap, but really needs a bigger strategic differentiation between like the advanced technology that the United States produces compared to that of China. Of course, that leads to this whole idea of if China were to focus simply on producing the lower capacity chips, then it runs the risk of flooding the markets with the low level of chips, right? And that could distort markets too.
Yeah, what's interesting about...
Sorry, Kevin, go ahead.
No, so the rule on October 7th on the mature versus advanced is really quite significant. And one of the reasons for the rule's complexity is that it bends over backward to not have an impact on mature node production. The export controls are focused just on the advanced node logic and memory, GPUs, supercomputer, advanced compute applications, and the broader policy topic about whether export control should be used for mature node technologies to address the economic flooding of the market mentioned earlier has not really been had, it seems, within the government because the rule is actually focused just on advanced, not mature, and leaving other trade policy tools to deal with that other. We'll see if that changes over time, but that's where things are as of now.
And that really makes it into a security issue rather than an economic issue, right? So.
Exactly my point. Exactly.
I would argue, though, that the security issue is not just advanced nodes. If we're dependent upon China for any kind of chips in our weapon systems, we're vulnerable to them. And so I agree with kind of where the administration is on that, but I do think we're going to have to at some point bite the bullet and talk about import bans. And so ITIF released a report about 2 weeks ago up in the Senate with Senator Mark Warner spoke at the event, where we argued for dusting off and reforming what's called Section 337 of the 1930 Tariff Act, which is a tool essentially that the U.S. International Trade Commission has to ban imports when there's either IP theft or IP issues or unfair trade practices. Problem with that provision, it's largely been hijacked sometimes by patent trolls to just sue U.S. or other multinationals that are in America to sort of hold them hostage. Hey, if you don't, we're gonna ban all your imports if you don't hand over money. What it really needs to be doing is refocus it on essentially China and to be able to say, hey, China, you're producing these 28 nanometer chips. And oh, by the way, it looks like you're massively subsidizing them. Oh, and there's some intellectual property theft there. We're not going to allow you to export them into the US. And ideally, we'd get our allies to join along with that. I think ultimately we're going to have to get there if we want to prevent China from, really, really doing damage to some of our advanced industries. I think we're going to have to take that kind of step.
Great. Thanks so much. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. I'd like to take Keith Mason's question. He's at Northrop Grumman, and I quote, to Kevin Wolf, can you compare and contrast Korea's approach for supply to the defense industrial base to Japanese companies' use of the 3P policy and the Wassenaar arrangement as reasons for not supplying to the defense industrial base?
It was a little fuzzy to hear. Could you repeat? I couldn't hear the whole question. Say again.
Yeah, so let me just repeat it. Can you please compare and contrast Korea's approach for supply to the defense industrial base to Japanese companies' use of the 3P policy and the Wassenaar arrangement as reasons for not supplying to the defense industrial base?
I'm probably not the best expert on that. I could guess, but I want to think more about it. Let me ask the questioner to give me a call, and we can speak separately. I don't want to. I need to think more about that answer.
Okay,
so,
all right.
See, I don't know everything, and I'm willing to pause. I want to think more about it. That's a hard question.
No, that's great. So Keith, if you could reach out directly to Kevin.
Kevin, you clearly haven't figured out the Washington thing. You're supposed to pretend you're an expert on everything.
No, it's an excellent question. I think I have an answer, but I want to practice it in my head first before. So give me a call later and we'll work through it.
All right. So we also have a question from someone who identifies himself as Steve, and who's a director. So I'm not exactly sure who Steve is, but let me just read his question. China has just announced an additional $169 billion in semiconductor investment to eliminate dependence on foreign sources for production capability. This drives China towards an insular policy that will this drives China towards an insular policy set that will close that market that will close the market to outsiders. Does that not reduce the available market?
Of course it does, but it's somewhat of an irrelevant question. If they were going to do that, that's the plan. That's the goal. Look at Made in China 2025 and look at their quantitative goals for domestic production as a share of overall domestic consumption. China's always intended to do this. They've never hidden the ball. They've always intended to do this. The fact that we've now thrown some sand in the gears is going to make them spend a lot more money and hopefully waste money. But the game was never unclear. China would never. I mean, look at what they've done with telecom equipment. In 1995, we had pretty much 80 to 90. When I say we, the Allies had 80 to 90% of the Chinese telecom equipment market. Today, they give us 3 to 4 and 5%. And they could take that away anytime they wanted to. They just sort of have this de minimis amount they give to Ericsson and Nokia to make it look like they actually have an open market. They don't have an open market. Same thing with solar panels. So yeah, they're going to do this, but they were going to do it anyway.
And if I may, Shohoko, I'll quickly just note that when we think about production and semiconductor production, It's not something that you can just throw money at and kind of arrive at a solution, right? It takes a lot of hard work, a lot of technological capabilities, a lot of R&D, a lot of everything, right, to get to a place where you're producing chips. And this is not just I'm not even implying just leading edge. This is at all aspects, right? And so when we think about producing chips, right, it's much more hard to go from A to B than it is to go from simply just money to chips. And now we're the leader and we can close off full markets.
Yeah, Jay, I'm glad you really pointed that out about how complicated this whole semiconductor. When we talk about the supply chain, it simply isn't just about that. It's about the design, the innovation, the research, the application, all of it. We not only have to have talent, we not only have to have investment, but it also, at the end of the day, it also has to be cost efficient too. So with that, Jay, if I can ask you about some of the considerations that companies like Samsung will make in terms of their future investments, as we see this landscape changing, and we see the United States taking a very hard stance towards China, and making it harder for companies to actually invest in advanced technologies in China without repercussion. What are do the criteria for investing in the United States change? One, and then because the United States is a federal system, some states are far more attractive than others. And traditionally, it used to be, well, if we want to do innovation stuff, everybody does in Silicon Valley and has like incubator investors kind of focused in that area. If you want talent, perhaps you go to like the East Coast, you go to Boston, wherever production we're seeing in Arizona, etc. Korea has now become the biggest provider of FDI to Kentucky and other states. What is the calculus for companies, for Korean companies, Samsung in particular, to invest in the United States?
It's a very good question, and I'm very happy to answer it because it's the one I like talking about a lot. So when we think about it, there's a number of factors, and maybe in no specific order, but an important order nevertheless, is when we first think about it, cost, right? I noted this at the outset, but there is this cost differential between producing and operating. I should be most clear, right? There's the initial CapEx spend, and then there's the OpEx, right? There's a difference in both, right? And so there's cost differential, 30% plus between Korea and the US, right? We think of broader customer demand, right? From what we hear from our customers, they want us to be close to them. Maybe it's easier to manufacture, it's easier to process, right? Instead of sending items or people on a boat or a plane that crosses from Korea to the US, it's maybe a little bit more efficient to produce in Austin and Taylor, where we'll be producing in a few years here. And then sending those items to elsewhere in Texas or in California or wherever else they may go in the United States. There's other aspects that fit into the kind of where we are interested in investing, right? And we see this not just from Samsung, but from every semiconductor company, right? And that's access to talent. It's a very big one, right? And that's a core consideration about not just hiring EE PhDs, but also workers available to work in the fab and just technicians in the clean rooms, right? Their needs across the board. Right. And then maybe another fundamental factor that I think certainly Samsung and others that operate in Austin saw in February 2021 is access and availability of stable infrastructure. Right. This is access to water, access to power, and the price sensitivity of all of that. Right. As you all know, in Texas, there's a horrible winter storm that froze and shut down much of the city and the larger part of the state. So access to consistent power that produce it for fabs that are very, very reliant on stable power, it's critical.
So one of the questions I have is kind of related to that question about China's investment in the semiconductor industry. If the United States is successful in implementing these export controls, and its allies and partners in the European Union, Asia are on board, it's going to stifle China's technology advancements, right? And I think we're not expecting the Chinese Communist Party to actually change its practices as a result of the actions taken by the United States. So in that light, what is the possibility of China actually being able to kind of come up with its own advance its own technologies so that it actually can be more self-sufficient and it can actually have its own network of semiconductors. Is that not a possibility out there?
Well, that was always the plan as the Chinese state policy from the beginning. You know, a lot of people say that export controls will enhance and incentivize indigenous development, which is true. It may change the pace, but Chinese government policy has always been to not be dependent upon the West for key inputs. And export controls will certainly delay and degrade the ability and the speed by which those objectives are achieved, but not ultimately stop it, particularly if the controls are not imposed by allies of the US. So anyway, that's the short answer, I think, to your question. Rob or Jay, longer answers?
I guess I would say I would certainly agree with Kevin. I think, though, one of the things that everybody's talking about semiconductors now, because we passed the CHIPS Act and now we're doing the semiconductor controls. I think it's important to realize that while semiconductors are foundational, or they're important to every industry now almost, the game cannot just be about semiconductors. China is seeking technological advantage across the board, and there are many critical industries that they want to gain that in. So, that's point number one. Point number two is I think we have to do a better job of convincing. We can use carrots and we can use sticks, convincing our allies that they have to think about export controls in a new way. And Kevin has been very articulate on this. Right now, some of our allies are looking at these Biden semiconductor export controls and saying, well, convince us that these are really related to military goals. And that's the wrong question. It's really the wrong question because number one, even if they are, if they're related to military goals, then they should come aboard. If they're not related to military goals, the importance of dual use technologies and the ability of countries to be powerful in technology overall is a really key component of national power. So national power doesn't just come from weapon systems anymore. It comes from the ability to have dependency, have low dependency on others, and have others have high dependency on you. And if the Chinese can gain that, in other words, reduce dependency on the West and increase and impose dependency on others, that's why they have tried to get a global monopoly on rare earths. It's not about the fact that they need rare earths. It's about imposing dependencies. And allies need to understand that that's the world we're living in now. And do you want to be dependent upon China? Have China tell you what to do? Do you want their overall economic, technology, and military system to be super strong at the expense of where you are? So I think the Biden administration has to do more to convince the allies that we're in a different world, and this is not it's not even the world of Kevin Wolf in the Obama administration, in the early Obama administration.
That is true.
Yeah. And I think also one of the arguments that countries outside of the United States always raises is about the political instability within the United States, that we've seen there are a lot of extremism emerging in US politics, and we have a presidential election coming up in 2 years' time. It may move from Democratic government to Republican government, even if it's another Democratic government. To what extent do current policies actually stay? Does it have legs? To what extent can they commit? But I think when we start having that argument, it's really important to emphasize that there is a continuum even from the Trump administration to the current Biden administration, that the China policy, for all of the clashes and the differences between Trump and Biden, the Democrats and the Republicans, is that this hardline stance towards China has actually only furthered and that we are seeing greater clarity when it comes to economic policy towards China. And that even if there is a political shift, that kind of positioning, hard-line stance towards China will remain and actually move forward. So that brings me to my next question is, okay, so we have the October 7th export controls towards semiconductors. But as Rob said, it's not just semiconductors, it's all these other areas as well. The implication of the technology use of semiconductor AI, we all talk about. What is going to come next? Is the export controls actually going to go beyond semiconductors into AI and also into the flow of money, like investment? Is there going to be the curtailing of capital to China?
Yeah, I think your question is the answer. So what is really remarkable and laudable is with all the the chaos that you were referring to earlier, there's actually evolving a rather coherent national security objective that the U.S. is articulating that's non-classical, and that I assume is being discussed with the allies to address your previous point and Rob's point about thinking more broadly about what national security means. And that's reflected in the October 7th rules, the response to the Russian invasion, the Jake Sullivan speech, Secretary Raimondo's speech a couple of weeks ago, the executive order on on CFIUS, on inbound investments in terms of what the priorities are. And then with what is most likely to happen probably early next year, either an executive order or public discussions of legislation to regulate investments at a minimum in the indigenous development and production of the technologies that are now subject to export controls. And this is something that the National Security Advisor has been speaking about since before he joined the government, which is if somebody's not allowed to export technology to develop a technology of concern, advanced known supercomputers, AI applications, et cetera, we as a country shouldn't allow investment using non-US technology in the indigenous development of exactly the same thing. And at a minimum, there should at least be some sort of notice and system in place for who does what where. There has been lots of different legislative ideas floated as part of the CHIPS Act that was ultimately removed that would go after far broader objectives, supply chain insecurity issues that I think most people thought were too broad. But certainly in terms of what's next is the outbound investment discussion, which is like reverse CFIUS or export controls without US technology kind of discussion. And that'll be a spirited debate next year. In terms of underlying technologies, probably, this is a guess, because the administration has very good operational security. There are very few leaks as to what it's actually doing, which makes things different than before. But my prediction would be things like that are consistent with Jake Sullivan's speech on the advanced compute. And sort of what's left in that space is the quantum computing, both because of its capability to break encryption if sufficiently advanced, and its advanced compute capabilities to do the very things that were described in the October 7th rule. The difficulty with quantum is it's a very nascent technology, and there's concern about doing more harm than good to it. It's not something at all that's unique to the United States in terms of capabilities. And there are at least 4 very different ways of going about achieving what is called quantum computing, and I'll let others get into the details. And then the next thing I think that you will see is frankly how to deal with the failure of the multilateral regime, the Wassenaar arrangement. In the first week of December, they announced their new changes for 2022, and almost nothing was agreed to, particularly in each of these sectors that we're referring to here. And although the proceedings are confidential, I have to assume that Russia at least blocked any material progress. And so my idea for creating, at least first informally and then formally, an additional regime of a smaller group of countries, of which Korea, of course, would be a core member, and I think should gain traction over the course of the next year because of the failure of Wassenaar to address these these current contemporary national security issues by virtue of the need to get consensus of all members. So those are in this space. Those are things that I think. Rob, Jay, other ideas for 2023?
So yeah, those are all good ones. I guess one of the things that I worry about is that we sort of have, for a long time in Washington, we had the China doves, don't do anything. What I worry about is going sort of the pendulum swing too far over to the other side. I mean, you actually now have people who argue that we shouldn't export chips to China. And that to me would be a disaster. I mean, I'm not talking about specific chips for specific military application. I'm just talking about regular chips. That would be a disaster because they would, first of all, they'd get the chips somewhere else. And secondly, or they'd produce them themselves. They would gain sales. They would move down the learning curve. We would lose sales and we would lose some of that advantage. So we've got to be strategic about how we go after what we want. I think the current example we're seeing this week about TikTok, to me, suggests some of how you can go overboard. TikTok kind of be one of the last things I'd worry about. There's just so much bigger fish to fry with regard to China, and a social media app where they can learn that you like watching videos about, I don't know, people dancing. It's like I just don't care. But it's sort of like, well, that's an easy thing. We got to go after China. Let's do this thing. So I hope calmer and cooler and frankly more strategic heads prevail here. And one last thing I'll just say, and that's a commercial for our own idea. I do think that ultimately we've got to do some serious Section 337 reform in this coming legislative session. There are some legislative bills in there to try to move in that direction. But I think that would be an important thing. And the last point I'll just make with regard to Kevin's point about using export controls or CFIUS with regard to investment by U.S. firms in China or tech transfer to China. Overall, I think it's a good idea, but if it's not done in coordination with our allies, it really can hurt American companies. They just, oh, you don't want to invest here? Fine, don't invest here. We'll get the Japanese to invest here instead. They can take this advantage. They can take this opportunity, or we'll get the Germans to do it. That is a real risk. And so while I think the idea is an important one, it should be done through Kevin's new, group of 6 or group of 8 or whatever it is. And that's the place I think it should happen.
And then one thing I just want to quickly note, I think all of this kind of is under the veil of politics, right? We're in the last 2 years of this administration, and perhaps so we're seeing a change in Congress, obviously, with Republicans taking the House, and so now we'll get to a place of what new actions will happen, right? We kind of had these indications of ideas from the more hawkish Republicans on China, and so maybe we'll see some of these come back into the fold, maybe in a stronger way. And so, looking ahead, I think there'll be a place where we see some ideas that were kind of dead come back to life, zombie policy, if you will. So maybe with that, I'll turn it back to you, Shahoko.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. We only have 3 minutes left, and I really actually wanted to talk about not perhaps the challenge of getting all even like-minded countries on board with some of the broader objectives of the United States. But that will be a bigger conversation. So I just want to refer to a question from the audience. This is for Jay. Are Korean companies interested in establishing assembly and test operations in the United States to package semiconductors?
It's a good question. On advanced packaging and broader capabilities, yes. I think I'll say Korean companies, and just speaking at the most broad level, are very interested in kind of all opportunities, whether that's memory, whether that's obviously we do memory in Korea, we do logic foundry in the United States, in Austin and Taylor, and we have a lot of R&D partnerships. So we're obviously looking always to business opportunities wherever they may be.
Yeah, and that can actually lead to healthy competition amongst U.S. states as well, right? To attract that kind of really lucrative capital to ensure like state government growth as well. We're almost close to time, so we're going to have to go our separate ways shortly. But before we do, I do want to point out that tomorrow we will actually be having an online conversation about electric vehicles and U.S.-Korea cooperation. So I hope you will be able to join that. The discussion will be moderated by my colleague, Duncan Wood, Vice President for Special Initiatives here at the Wilson Center. So with that, I do please join me in thanking Rob Atkinson, Kevin Wolf, and Jay Chicharan for really allowing us to have a more in-depth assessment of what's going on in the semiconductor industry, how it may or may not impact US-Korea relations. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you.